Consent given.
Wait, all right, can I hear that again? I just don't think I got the first couple there.
Consent given.
Thanks.
You have my consent.
Cool. Thanks,
Yeah, my
Arturo.
consent.
Thank you. All right. And I just uploaded last Thursday's session over I think yesterday. I just uploaded last Thursday's session on contemporary photography and put the link up on Blackboard. All right, here's Graham. Hello, Graham. He's connecting, looks like. Graham? No, he's muted.
Hi.
Hi. You okay with us recording?
Yes, sir.
Okay, cool. And nobody has to unmute audio or video, although if you're willing to do that, it's always nice to see your lovely faces and hear your lovely voices. Then I will feel as though I'm not alone in the void here. All right, I'm going to share my screen. And we are going to get started. So as I announced in my last email, we are going to be on break for the remainder of this week. So there will not be a class session this Thursday. And the quizzes and the readings for this unit aren't the quizzes and presentations should be posted next Sunday, but you'll have, I guess, an additional week to work on them.
Okie dokie.
And today we're going to start with the essay by Miwon Kwon called From Sight to Community in New Genre Public Art, a Case of Culture in Action. Somebody's beeping.
Oh, can you guys hear that? I'm so
Is that your
sorry.
lunch?
No. It is my computer notifications going off. I'm sorry. I don't know how to mute that.
It's all right. A little beeping between friends is not a problem. I would rather hear the beeping than not hear you. So.
I wish you didn't have to hear that. That's why I normally mute myself.
It's okay.
My family thinks it's necessary to know what I'm doing at all times. So I have both my grandmothers and all three of my aunts texting me on the daily.
Wow. Well, that's, good to stay connected and in touch.
Very.
I need to be better about that, but I have been checking in with my mother
That's good.
regularly. Yeah.
Moms are important.
Yeah, they are. And speaking of important stuff, you like that segue? That was a great segue.
Yeah, that was perfect.
Okay. The focus of this essay is on an exhibition curated by this woman, Mary Jane Jacobs, who is invited to guest curate an art festival called Sculpture Chicago. This is a festival held every 2 years in the city of Chicago, focusing on sculpture. And she had made a reputation in 1991 putting together a project called Places with a Past, which was a public sculpture project that invited artists from around the world to come to Charleston, South Carolina, which is where the project originated, and to create works of public art that responded to the history of the areas around Charleston. So this was a new way of thinking about site-specific art, art that was not just intended to be installed and experienced in a particular physical location, but works of art that were first addressed to the public, and second of all, that were inspired by or in dialogue with the local histories and communities of the region. And the organizers of Sculpture Chicago were so impressed by this that they invited Mary Jane Jacobs to come to their city and do something along similar lines. And so she conceived of Culture in Action, which she called a public art program. And it was much like her previous project. It involved bringing together a group of artists from all over. Most of them were not from Chicago, to create works that were intended to engage directly with the Chicago public. And that, in her mind, meant the public at large, not just the art-going public, but art that spoke to the local community. And in fact, going even a step beyond the Places with a Past project in terms of scale and ambition, her idea for Culture in Action is that it would match up the artists invited with community groups and members of the Chicago community to kind of collaborate on various public art works, projects, interventions of all different sorts. So this was a very large-scale effort that involved a tremendous amount of organization and coordination of people and resources, and it took 2 years to kind of all come together and to be realized. The author of this reading, Mi-Lan Kwon, is taking a look back from some years on at the project as a whole, and exploring the different projects that were put together under the umbrella of Culture in Action and Sculpture Chicago, and compare and contrast them in terms of the different strategies employed, the different types of relationships between artists and community members, and kind of how successful the different projects were in achieving various, sometimes different or varied goals. So there were 8 different projects. Each one was executed by one of these teams, this partnership between an artist and a community group. And they, the other thing that was important for Mary Jane Jacobs and for many of the artists involved, of course, is that the partnership be a two-way street, that it not just involve an artist coming in and telling the local community group members, all right, this is what I want you to do, and having them execute the plan. The idea is that from the very beginning, community groups would be involved in kind of thinking through, brainstorming, planning, organizing, and giving shape to these different projects. And so it took a long time for many of the different works to be planned out and conceived, and involved a lot of back and forth communication, negotiation. There were other stakeholders involved, community centers that were involved in hosting some of these projects. There were, the idea is that this would be a new kind of public art, and it was given the name New Genre Public Art to emphasize this difference. The idea being that the the artworks, it was partly the process and the interaction and the relationship between the artists and the community that made up the work of art, or made up the content of the work of art, as this artist and critic, Joe Scanlon, wrote. Joe Scanlon, being a artist and critic based in Chicago, wrote about this in Frieze, and said that the project brings together these artists, these communities, and the viewers from wherever in this new kind of relationship to become the center and the focus of the work of art. So Quan is very intrigued by the this method that the curator employed in collaboration with the various artists. It was certainly a very unique curatorial venture in that there was a tremendous amount of input required from the curator herself and her whole team. The curators had to, Mary Jane Jacobs in particular, had to facilitate all of these interactions, matching up, in many cases, the artists with community groups. There were only a few cases in which the artists themselves were very specifically able to identify who they were interested in working with, and had the means of coming to Chicago to advance the project. And so the curators also, and Mary Jane Jacobs specifically, had played a big part in also shaping the outcomes of a lot of these partnerships. So Quan is interested in the potential of this new approach to shake up people, the kind of elitism of the art world, and bring contemporary art into more direct contact and communication with the wider world and non-art audiences in many cases, including underprivileged audiences or underprivileged communities and social groups who could be given a voice and given some agency through underneath the umbrella and within the structure of this larger curatorial project. On the other hand, she notes some of the contradictions and kind of paradoxes of this whole endeavor. She points out that the emphasis on community and even the language, the word itself and the rhetoric surrounding community has sometimes served political aims that are very far removed, political and social agenda very far removed from the curators and from the artists who participated, specifically neoconservative critics of government programs, of government welfare programs and relief programs, have mobilized this rhetoric around community to suggest that people need to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and not rely on handouts from above, government handouts. So even although the aim is completely different here, and the goal for Culture in Action was to empower some of these local communities within the city who typically are excluded from conversations around art or from the experience of making and viewing works of art. Just using these terms and kind of embracing something of the ideology of this kind of community-based talk constitutes a potential pitfall or problem for Kwan. But on the other hand, she also acknowledges that these kinds of artistic interventions can be seen as an attempt to fill the gap left behind by the defunding of the kind of the defunding of social agencies and government-funded organizations and groups that had previously worked at the local level, at the grassroots level, to help people in their day-to-day lives. All right, so the first project that Kwan talks about, it was one that was developed by the artist Suzanne Lacey in collaboration with a coalition of women civic leaders and community leaders in the city of Chicago. And Suzanne Lacey had long been interested in the idea of public art and in kind of pushing the envelope on public art to, especially to use it to serve the goals of raising public consciousness on issues, particularly issues of importance to women. And so she created this, she led this project called Full Circle, which took the form of a kind of guerrilla installation that deposited 100 half-ton boulders around the streets of Chicago, downtown Chicago, in the area called the Loop. These boulders each bore a bronze plaque acknowledging the contributions of one particular Chicago woman. 90 of them were living women, and 10 were historical figures from Chicago's past. Because one of the things that she noticed or discovered in the course of kind of brainstorming her contribution to Sculpture Chicago was the fact that there were no major monuments in the entire city dedicated to women.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
No, like the fact that they like used rocks as like just like plain, like I don't know, like normally monuments are like super beautiful and like spatially like beautifully carved and like accentuated, and the fact that I feel like she's making a point saying like, oh, these rocks are for 100 women that you guys didn't give a, excuse my language, you didn't give a shit about, so here you go.
So yeah, I mean that's a valid point, and I think you are suggesting that this was intentional, right? That she's kind of making an ironic statement here by just presenting.
Why there's a bunch of controversy surrounding it, probably.
Yeah, I mean, why would people have a problem with the appearance of these monuments? The fact that they're uncarved, it could be controversial, of course, because some people just might not consider them pleasant to look at, right? But also, if the idea is to memorialize the achievements or to commemorate the achievements of Chicago women, some people might object to the fact that they aren't more beautiful or more attractive or appealing.
Yeah, so it could be like a diss as well.
Yeah, so this is definitely worth exploring. What were Lacey's intentions behind this choice? One thing that's worth pointing out is that these boulders were quarried from a limestone quarry in Oklahoma that was entirely woman-owned. So that was a very conscious choice, right?
Yeah.
And in that way, maybe she is calling attention to the contributions of women in
Industrial.
in industry, or the ability of women to perform jobs or to carry out roles from which they've traditionally been excluded. There are probably
Yeah.
not a lot of rock quarries in this country that are entirely woman owned.
Yeah, and that's quite a statement.
Yeah. But you also see in the background that curious looking object, that enormous thing across the street.
Is that supposed to be like a bird or something?
So that, yeah, it's a sculpture, right? And it couldn't be more different from Suzanne Lacey's intervention here.
Yeah.
In terms of its appearance, its size, and scale, as well as artistic style. So I think, that photograph was composed very consciously to underscore this contrast, right? This contrasting relationship. The work is by Picasso. It was a large-scale sculpture that Picasso designed. He was not involved at all in installing it, as far as I'm aware, and I don't know that he ever even came to Chicago. But for the city, it must have seemed like a major coup, a major achievement to have been able to commission a large-scale sculpture, work on this scale from the most famous living artist, 1965, and it's titled "Head of a Woman." So the contrast that some critics drew is between traditional public sculpture of this type and the nature of Suzanne Lacey's project, which so strongly contrasts with that model of art making or of art, public art display. And we could take this back to an earlier reading from closer to the beginning of the semester, the essay by Rosalind Krauss called "Sculpture in the Expanded Field," where she went through this kind of little history of modernism in sculpture and how modernist sculpture was reacting, in effect, against the tradition of monumental sculpture. So to start with, we might start with a extremely, classic or traditional example of monumental sculpture, more classic by far than Picasso's Head of a Woman. This is the example that one of the examples that Krauss cites, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, which is located in the city of Rome and which depicts a famous Roman emperor, but which was relocated in Renaissance times by the Pope, the Renaissance Pope I can't remember which Pope it was, in fact, as a kind of statement of the unbroken nature of this legacy, which stretches all the way from the emperors of ancient Rome to modern day popes. In Renaissance times, the Pope being the ruler of the city of Rome and of all the Roman territories.
Was it a Leo?
What's that?
I think the Pope was a Leo.
Was it a Leo?
Yeah, I think it was like Leo Leo the Third. I just read a reading for this history class on Marcus Aurelius, and I think it was Pope Leo the Third.
Okay, well, there was a Pope Leo in Renaissance times, Leo the Tenth, I think. He was a Medici Pope. So
There we go.
maybe it was him.
Maybe.
I should know this, but I can
I
always,
don't know it. I don't.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember.
I'm not a specialist in Renaissance art, even though I sometimes pretend like I
want
am.
to see. That'd be fun.
Yeah. So, okay. So, how would we start by comparing Suzanne Lacey's boulders here with this equestrian statue from ancient
Well,
Roman times?
They are similar material types. They're industrial pieces, like bronze is an industrial piece, and it's from a limestone quarry, correct?
The boulder,
Yes,
what you're talking about? Yeah, the boulder
it's from a
is
limestone.
yes, yeah.
So they're both like industrial like materials. That's what they're made out of. But in other shapes, like they're pretty much opposites. Like there's fine details on the equestrian statue. It's obvious it's a like sculpture of Marcus Aurelius, and the full circle is just like an odd. I don't know how would I describe that shape. Just an oddly shaped boulder. There's
Yeah, and they came in all different shapes, but they're all kind of rough and irregular, like this
yeah,
one.
they're just kind of. It's not like calculated and precise like the equestrian statue is. Excuse me.
Right. So one, is completely there are similarities in the materials. You have the bronze equestrian statue, and you have the bronze plaque. You have the limestone boulder in Suzanne Lacey's work, and you have the stone pedestal of the Marcus Aurelius statue. But the stone, at least, is completely unworked in Lacey's work, uncarved, unshaped, rough, direct from the quarry. And the both the cast bronze and the pedestal on which it stands in the Marcus Aurelius statue are shaped, by the hands of the sculptor or the sculptor's workman to represent this figure. And so that also underscores a similarity between the two, right? They are both intended to commemorate the achievements of a specific individual. But they do so in different ways, and the form of each of these objects is completely, they're at opposite ends of the spectrum, as Laja said.
Yeah.
Any other similarities or differences? Anyone else want to point out? So I don't know if we talked about this. I don't think we did. One other very important difference is that the statue of Marcus Aurelius was intended to be permanent, and the Suzanne Lacey installation was temporary. Like all of the sculpture, all of the Culture in Action projects, it was not a permanent installation. And that also resonates with the argument that Krauss is making in her essay on modernist sculpture. I mean, she uses this example, the equestrian statue, the ancient Roman statue of Marcus Aurelius, as a foil for talking about how towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, this traditional approach, this traditional way of conceiving of monumental sculpture starts to break down. It's no longer tenable for various reasons, in part because the vision of the artist diverges from the public. So I'm asking you to reach way back to your recollections of this reading from several months ago, but this was another important work discussed in that essay by Rosalind Krauss, Balzac, portrait, monumental portrait of the famous French writer by Auguste Rodin. The comparison, we could identify some of the same differences here and similarities. This is again a bronze sculpture, and it was intended to be permanent, unlike Lacey's work for Culture in Action. But where might we take the comparison from there? Are these works maybe more similar in some way than the previous pairing? Are they different in other ways? Does anyone, sorry, I cut you off.
They're both like rough looking.
Yes, right.
Like, they look like they both are stone, like come from a stone.
Yeah, they both have that kind of to different degrees, of course, but the Rodin statue shares some of that formlessness, that kind of unshaped, rough or unshaped or unworked quality of the raw boulder. And that was exactly the reason why Rodin's statue was not permanently installed in the place that was originally intended for it, because people basically, couldn't handle. They didn't like the they regarded these more experimental aspects of Rodin's process and technique as ugly and even absurd. It didn't match, it didn't correspond to their expectations of what a monumental portrait statue should look like. And I think the writer himself was not terribly pleased with Rodin's work. So, today it sits in the sculpture garden of the Museum of Modern Art. At least one of the versions does. And it has ended up in this condition of homelessness, in a sense, that Krauss diagnoses as one of the essential characteristics of modernist sculpture. That modernist sculpture is not intended for a specific site, that it can exist anywhere, and is frequently, ideally viewed within a blank white gallery space, because it is meant to be self-sufficient. All right. Similar fate befell Rodin's Gates of Hell, which was intended to serve as the doors to a museum of decorative arts that I think was never constructed or never completed. And he did produce a couple of different versions of this in his lifetime. Some of them were, some versions were cast after his death, I think. But like his statue of Balzac, it's a peculiar work that looks even more like it was intended for a specific location, but now can only be viewed, in isolation or detached from any kind of architectural context. And in the essay by Krauss, Sculpture in the Expanded Field, she says that in this way, modernist sculpture absorbs its own base in a sense, or quite literally, the base or the pedestal being what marks a particular object as a sculpture, as a monument, and what sets it apart from its surroundings. In modernist sculpture, that base, either it disappears or it becomes an inseparable part of the work. And Brancusi is her primary example of this. And this specific work by Brancusi is an especially good example because the name caryatid refers to these kinds of columns carved by the ancient Greeks in their temples that were carved in the shape of figures, human figures, usually women, supporting the the roof structure or the pediment of the temple facade. So this idea that a sculpture has to express concretely and in itself this essential structural function of support, the function traditionally served by the sculptural base, has a certain kind of resonance with Lacey's work. These limestone boulders suggesting, if nothing else, a kind of permanence and a kind of solidity and a strength that the artist may be positively associated with the achievements of these women. And maybe there is a sort of ironic intention here too, as Ladja suggested earlier, because these boulders were only installed temporarily, but the artist seems to have made them as difficult as possible to install and remove, and really to emphasize the notion that whatever happens to the actual markers, these actual blocks of stone, the achievements of the women themselves that are commemorated in these plaques are permanent parts of the city's fabric, and really the city's foundations. Now the process that Lacey followed in conceiving of the work and determining its final form is also an essential part of the whole project. So she, as I mentioned earlier, partly with the help of the curator, Mary Jane Jacobs, identified a group of women in Chicago who represented different groups or different these were civic leaders and leaders of community groups from different walks of life. She strove for racial diversity in putting together the coalition, and also in choosing the women who were to be commemorated. But the list of Chicago women who were ultimately being memorialized in the work was drawn up kind of by committee. So it was not the artist alone who decided who made the cut. This was a list that was produced jointly with all of these members of this local coalition. And so in that sense, it was very much a collaborative project. And it allows us to draw comparison with other collaborative projects or other projects that that shared a similar kind of aim. So Judy Chicago's Dinner Party is another work that came to mind. And what kinds of similarities could we identify here between these two works that might make sense for us to look at them side by side? Anyone? What was the goal of Chicago's dinner party? What was the concept behind it? What do all these different place settings around this triangular table represent?
It's
It's
like,
Sorry, Maya.
I was just gonna say it like is giving tribute to women.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So that would be a something that these two projects had in common, right?
Yeah.
Are there differences between the kinds of women who are being celebrated in each case?
They're
Yeah.
both dead and alive. Like
Dead and alive? Well,
Mhm.
you mean in Full Circle? There were, let me think. I think it was 90 of the women celebrated in Full Circle were living women, and 10 of them were dead. And so, by contrast, you're saying that Chicago's dinner party was primarily dedicated to women of the past, right?
Also, women of myth.
Right. So that's
Or
one.
not myth. I don't mean myth. Like religion, like religious holy figures. My bad.
Yeah, like goddesses.
Yes. Yes.
Right. And some women, who are semi-legendary, I guess.
Yeah, like I think Virginia Woolf was one of them, and then wasn't she? Or
Yeah,
no?
well, she is a modern author, and I'm not sure. I think I don't know if she was alive or not when this work was made. That's a good question.
I don't know what I'm thinking. There was something. They had a lot of really big common like spearhead names in like women and feminist history on
Yeah,
on
right.
the party.
Yeah, so from throughout history and from around the world also, right?
Yeah.
So Chicago, and this is one of the things that was maybe a little controversial around her work. She tried to include women of different cultures and different civilizations, but many of the women were American or European, and those who weren't, a disproportionate number were either goddesses or mythical figures or figures from the remote historical past.
Right.
So in some ways, she ran into criticism for her list being too kind of Western focused or Eurocentric, too white, you could even say. Although she made an effort to represent other cultures. Suzanne Lacy, likewise, was very concerned to include some diversity in, and partly through the nature of the coalition that she put together, they were able to do that, to include African American women from Chicago's history as well as white women, women maybe of other ethnicities. But by the nature of the project, it was limited to women from the city of Chicago. So that kind of took care of part of some of the potential pitfalls that could arise in a work like Chicago's. Other similarities and differences.
I think it's really interesting, this comparison, because they both do kind of the same thing, but in different styles.
Mm-hmm.
My problem with Suzanne Lacy's, I guess it's not really a problem, but it feels really kind of impersonal, like every person just gets a boulder.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Judy Chicago's each individual dinner plate is really personalized for the individual. But on the other hand, Lacey's project is personalized because everybody gets a plaque defining their own individual achievements on it. So they both exhibit a unity within their own projects, but the way that they, I guess, acknowledge women is completely different.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Chicago worked with a whole team of craftspeople to produce these different place settings, which consist of multiple elements. There are the plates, there are the cups, the table coverings or tablecloths at each setting. And the goal certainly was, as you say, Graham, to individualize them so that every setting in terms of the style or the decoration or the imagery in the plate refers to that particular woman's unique contributions or her her legend, her story, her iconography. On the other hand, as you also point out, she doesn't include the kind of textual information that we find on the boulders in Full Circle, which maybe tell us something that we don't already know, in contrast to Chicago's work, where we're kind of expected to come to the table, no pun intended, with some familiarity with these figures in order to enjoy the piece or appreciate the piece. Other points, other things people?
I think the rock kind of has some like hidden humor behind it. Like if I were to see it, I would think it's kind of funny.
Because it looks so out of place, or
Just because it's a rock with a plaque on it.
right? Yeah. So that, I think, yeah, you hit on something really essential about Suzanne Lacy's work. She's clearly trying to consciously avoid making something that's conventionally beautiful or attractive or appealing. And in that sense, she is maybe much more of a modernist than Judy Chicago, and more interested in challenging people's preconceptions of what a monument could be, perhaps. One other difference I'd point out is in terms of the nature of the collaboration. I mentioned this army of craftspeople that Chicago employed to create the dinner party. You know, she was not herself personally involved in creating the ceramic plates or weaving the tablecloth or the place settings or anything. But she relied on the skills of others. And on the one hand, you can say she is challenging the traditional exclusion of craft from the canon of modern art, from the Modern Art Museum. On the other hand, she was criticized for not really giving full credit to these people who actually produced the physical elements of the installation. The work, the dinner party, it has her name on it. And she credited the various people who she hired to create the different settings, but they are not credited as artists or as co-authors of the piece. That's true to some extent also of Suzanne Lacy's work, but the project was much more collaborative. And although, in the caption here, I've just given her name, there are different ways of identifying these works. Sometimes if you see Full Circle reproduced in a book or a journal essay, journal article, the artist credit will read Suzanne Lacy and Coalition of Chicago women as the creators of the work. So I would say many of the projects in Culture in Action went further than had traditionally been the case in giving credit to the artists' collaborators. Okay, another comparison would be with this work, which I can't remember if this, I think this may have been discussed in one of our earlier readings, the Whitney Chadwick, one of the Whitney Chadwick readings perhaps, by the African-American artist Faith Ringgold. This is a quilt that she created. She was trained as a painter, I want to say, but her mother taught her traditional African-American quilting techniques, and she produced a number of what she called story quilts. This is one which features a kind of mashup of imagery from history of modern art. You see sunflowers, of course, and you see the figure of Vincent van Gogh here on the right. And the setting is all this village where Van Gogh took up residence for a time while he was actively painting. But the figures who are portrayed here are various famous African-American women from history, including Sojourner Truth, who was a very important abolitionist, anti-slavery activist, and public speaker, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, and others, and even a ninth figure. This one here, I think, is a fictional character created by Ringgold. So this is another work which aims to pay tribute to women of the past, a group of women. Difference here would be, that the common thread connecting them is their identity as African American, in contrast to the connecting thread that links together the women commemorated in Full Circle, which is simply the city of Chicago itself, all residents of Chicago. And this is relevant because one of the observations that Mi-Hwan Kwon makes in her essay is that the women who are commemorated are kind of commemorated and celebrated as women. And even as the collaborators on the project made it a priority to include, a diverse, racially and maybe also socially diverse group of women on their list. The notion that they, that they all occupy the same kind of place in the history of the city is a little bit of a fiction, because in many points, at many times in the history of the city, race was a more defining characteristic in terms of where you were positioned within the social hierarchy than gender. And so Kwon refers to this as a kind of mythic community that Suzanne Lacy has created out of all of these 100 different women, some of whom would not have been on speaking terms, in life. And so some of those differences and tensions within the city's history are paved over, and by extension, you could say, this is this relates to one of the criticisms that's sometimes made of so-called second wave feminism, which is that it's very kind of focused on the needs and interests and experiences of white middle class women, or that, you know, it overlooks the very important divisions between women of different classes or different races that still today, you know, make it maybe difficult to organize, you know, to as a movement to kind of create an inclusive, a truly inclusive and representative women's movement that would take into account the interests of all of these different women from different groups. Image of Suzanne Lacey loading or unloading these boulders onto flatbed truck here. Some more installation shots of pedestrians walking by and either taking notice or not of these objects. And here's another comparison, which maybe I should have started with, but I think is kind of in the background of all of this. So we know a little bit about the history of Sarah's Tilted Arc. We know that it was this large-scale public art project funded by this federal art project that sets aside money for the installation of public sculpture when there are large-scale construction projects. And we know that it was removed against the artist's will just a short time after it was originally installed, just a few years after it was originally installed. So what were some of the reasons why you think it may have been removed, and how does that relate to the differences between these two artist projects, or how does it relate to the goals and objectives of culture and action as Mary Jane Jacobs set them forth here? What were some of the reasons why Tilted Arc was removed from this site in Federal Plaza, New York City? Does anyone remember, or does anyone have a sense?
Wasn't it because the people that were trying to get in and out of the building found it very tedious and annoying that they had to walk around it?
Yeah, that was one complaint, that it was like physically obstructing movement through the plaza.
Yeah, for the plaza, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Other points that might have been made against it?
It wasn't like it was blocking the view and was kind of hard to look at, I think.
So yeah, a lot of people thought it was ugly, right? And resented its presence because it didn't seem, even if they recognized that there might be people out there who appreciated this kind of art, the people who worked in the buildings surrounding it, worked in the federal courthouse and so forth, by and large did not appreciate modernist sculpture or postmodernist sculpture, if you want to call it that, following Douglas Crimp. So, I mean, in a nutshell, I think those are probably the two main objections that were raised to it. There were other criticisms as well, but this idea that it did not serve the purposes and did not meet the needs or even address the preferences of the people who actually occupied this site, the people who worked there, the people who, crossed the plaza every day in the course of their daily routines. So, in opposition to that, this new genre of public art was intended to address not just the physical site, but address itself to the people who occupied these sites. So site-specific in a much stronger sense, and strong in a different sense from the one that Thomas Crow identifies in his essay on site-specific art. He's primarily concerned with the difference between these site-specific works that are so challenging to the public or to the powers that be, that they necessarily are impermanent, like Gordon Matta Clark's building cuts, for example, or his window blowout, where he shot out the windows of this NYU building with an air rifle, versus Tilted Arc, which, as much as it may have challenged the people who encountered it on a daily basis, and perhaps ideally broaden their ideas of what art could be, it was intended to be permanent. And in fact, there was nothing in the nature of the piece itself that suggested impermanence. The fact that it ended up not being permanently installed was just kind of a natural byproduct of this relationship between the artist and the local community. Serra himself had fully intended for it to be a permanent installation. So that's another difference, of course, between these works, is that Lacey's piece and the other pieces associated with Culture in Action were temporary. One of the women who was very important in inspiration behind Full Circle was Jane Addams. She founded this institution called Hull House in 1889, which
coolest.
What's that?
She was the coolest. I read an autobiography on her, and the whole house was awesome. Like,
yeah. So tell us a little bit about the house.
Well, from what I remember, I read this in like high school, but she had a house. These people were sick, like with something. I don't remember. What do they have? They had like mental disorders, or did they have an actual sickness? I can't remember.
Some of the residents, yeah, I'm not sure, but
yeah, well, she
took them in.
Yeah, she like went and took care of them, and she was a very good lady from what I remember. I don't remember much. I'm sorry. That was not.
That's okay. Yeah.
Just
so this was kind of subsidized housing, in effect, for women who otherwise, couldn't have afforded to pay rent or what have you. But it was also a kind of community center. So it was an important early precedent for this idea of women, helping to advance the cause or the rights and the needs of women within the history, from Chicago history. And at this house, at Hull House, a dinner party was organized. The artist invited all of these notable feminists and activists, including people like Gloria Steinem, Susan Faludi, but also Anita Hill. And again, it was a diverse group of women. And this was documented. There's a video recording, so it was called a dinner performance at the Hull House Museum. And this formed another aspect of Lacey's contributions to Culture in Action. Many of the other arts projects also had this kind of extended life where, in addition to having a physical component, there might be a performance component or a social component. that made up the work. So there were different varieties of projects in Culture in Action. There were some where the curator was primarily responsible for matching up a community group with the artist. The artist would actually develop a proposal. So they had an idea of what kind of work they wanted to do before a community group was brought in to team up with them. And so the curator obviously plays a very important role here in making appropriate, matching up appropriate groups with the right artists. One example of this was the collaboration between this artist team, Simon Grennan and Christopher Sperandio, and the members of a Chicago labor union. This was members of the Bakery, Confection, and Tobacco Workers Union. So they held meetings and they kind of informally discussed issues that were important to them. But the resulting project was actually a candy bar, kind of riffing off of the nature of the work that a lot of these union members that they were engaged in, confectionery, candy making. And the candy bar was called The Workforce Makes the Candy of Their Dreams. So this was also a project that kind of took shape by committee. The artists surveyed the membership of the union to find out what kind of candy they liked best, thinking that maybe I guess that this would be that there'd be some kind of difference between the candy that they are paid to make on a regular basis and or as part of their routine jobs, and the candy that they would like to be making, or the candy that they liked eating. But if you are going to come up with the recipe for a new kind of candy bar based on a survey, you're probably going to get a fairly generic result, because if you average out everybody's tastes and preferences, you end up with the same old stuff that people are already manufacturing and buying and selling and eating. So the candy of their dreams turned out to be a chocolate bar with almonds. But they made up these nice labels. The chocolate bar was named We Got It. And I don't know how many of these were actually manufactured, but you can see a little box of them there. And then some representatives of the union holding up something. I'm not actually sure what that is in that photograph in the lower right. And so you could compare this with another example of more maybe traditional public art or public sculpture that is likewise addressed to the contributions of workers, of blue collar workers. This is not in Chicago. I forget where this is located. Jonathan Borofsky's sculpture Hammering Man. But obviously there are huge differences in terms of medium and material and technique and process, everything that we've been talking about so far. But another way to look at these projects is how successful is each of these works in giving a voice to the workers or empowering workers. What do people think? If we were to judge each of these on that basis. No comment. well, I don't really know what I would say about this either. Because honestly, I think both of these works maybe are well-intentioned, but I'm not sure how successful either one is in representing, authentically representing or empowering workers, giving people who manufacture chocolate bars for a living, like in a factory, the chance to design their own candy bar, sort of. I guess it should be understood as a symbolic gesture, but Mi-Hwan Kwon points out that, inevitably when you have these kinds of matchups, you're likely to find that something gets lost in translation, right? So this is a very kind of artificial relationship that was established between this one particular union and this artist team. So it's not clear that the artists really, were positioned in a, or capable of, opening up their process to something more truly collaborative in spirit. And so the result maybe is a little bit disappointing. We could also compare it to this work by Muriel Laderman-Ukeles, which in part was intended to call attention to the work of women's work, quote unquote, that is unrecognized and unpaid in the vast majority of cases, when women are expected to fulfill the role of the homemaker or the housekeeper and clean the house and do laundry and prepare all the meals and everything else. But it's the husband who is regarded as the one who works or who has a job. But she's also, you could also see it as a project that calls attention to these class differences between, the artists or the white collar worker, the intellectual worker, and the janitors and the maintenance staff who clean the floors of the museums and wash the pavement outside and so forth. So there is this history, even just within these last few decades of contemporary art practice, of artists who are attempting to represent or give voice to workers and to bridge the gap between the artist and the blue-collar worker. There's this other example, maybe similarly unsatisfying. Another artist team collaborated with representatives from the Resident Council of Ogden Courts Apartments in Chicago, housing project in Chicago, to create a paint color chart that was intended to address the drabness of the color schemes in a lot of government subsidized housing. So they came up with these colors and they gave them these kinds of ironic names like HUD cream, or urban renewal lime, subsidy mint, fair housing glacier. And that was the outcome of that collaboration. All right, well, running out of time here, but some others that are discussed at length in the reading, and which deserve more time than we can give them here, include Mark Dion's Chicago Urban Ecology Action Group. He worked with a group of high school students from Chicago's West Side, took them to the rainforests in Belize, South America, on a field trip to learn about ecology and to investigate the science of the rainforest. And then after teaching them these various skills in collecting specimens and surveying environments, brought them back to Chicago, where they investigated like the local park and the Lincoln Park Zoo and collected specimens of the trash that people had deposited in those places. There was this ambitious schedule of lectures and tours, Academy of Science, various science museums, and so forth. Lectures or class meetings where they learned about evolution, studied Darwin, learned about animal classification, zoology, and so forth. Met with Greenpeace and other activist groups dedicated to the causes of conservation and sustainability. And this is actually fairly characteristic of Mark Dian's process. He's done a number of these projects before and after this one, or at least after this one, where he collaborated with groups of school children or community members on these kinds of investigations. And something that always comes up with work like this is, how does the artist make a living by creating this kind of new genre of public art if it doesn't result in durable sculptures or paintings that can be hung in a museum? The answer in Mark Dian's case is that he does actually create drawings and paintings and some sculptures kind of as an adjunct to these projects that he then sells. But what he's best known for are these more participatory, kind of collaborative / educational public art collaborations. All right. So there were some other really cool collaborations or comparisons I wanted to highlight. These were not the first artists to kind of engage directly with the community. Gordon Matta Clark and his partners, shown here, opened up a restaurant in Soho in downtown Manhattan that was a cooperative restaurant. So it was owned by the people who worked there, and it served the local community, which included workers as well as artists, because a lot of artists had taken up residence there. This is a photograph that Matta Clark altered by crossing out the original, the sign, the words on the sign that originally hung over this when it was a privately owned restaurant, and writing over the door or the entrance here, food, which was the name that they gave to this co-op restaurant. And then this project by Inigo Manglano Ovalle, where he taught local Chicago members of local neighborhoods, youth in these local Chicago neighborhoods, how to use a video camera to shoot footage and edit it and make movies, specifically documentary movies, focusing on their own lives and experiences of their family members, and particularly the issue of gang violence. That was kind of the motivating factor in this work. The project was intended to bring together youth from rival gangs and in a sort of peaceable activity, and also in the documentary that they produced collectively, to focus on the deaths and the violence that had been brought about, the losses that the community had suffered due to gang violence. And then the project gave rise to this kind of exhibition where all these various television monitors were installed in outdoor settings or in the windows, these street front windows, playing back the documentary that these teenagers had put together. And now that I think about it, this comparison seems extraordinarily silly. So I'm not sure what motivated me, other than the resemblance between the visual resemblance between a bunch of monitors stacked on top of milk crates in a yard and these mirrored cubes of Robert Morris in this beautifully manicured lawn.
Well, if anything, they are both reflections of the world around them.
Nice. Thank you, Graham, for saving me from from myself there. I guess, yeah, there probably are. I guess that was sort of one thing that I had in mind, that Matt Morris's work intends to bring the viewers into the piece and to reflect the surroundings, but does so in a very limited way. Whereas Manglano Ovalle's Televecindario is really trying to reflect what's not visible, and what's not really always talked about, maybe within the community or within the media, and show things from the perspective of the people involved, rather than imposing a different framework or a different point of view onto this particular problem of gang violence. So, and I threw this Smithson in there too, because I think you could also draw a comparison between many of these projects, which aim to get art outside of the gallery or the museum setting, but also to bring people who don't, frequently look at art or visit galleries or museums, to have that experience. And in some ways, you can say, you can find precedents for this in post-minimalism and land art and works like Robert Smithson's Non-Sites, where he's specifically drawing attention to the artificial nature of the museum as a site by bringing it into some kind of dialogue with these industrial non-sites, as he calls them. But the difference being, of course, that Smithson totally ignores, it seems, the social dimension of this difference, the difference between the kinds of people who visit the museum and the kinds of people who, work in a limestone quarry. Whereas the artists who participate in Culture in Action are very much addressing that difference or that disparity. And so maybe a comparison here with Suzanne Lacey's Full Circle would have been even more appropriate. Julio. All right. So that, I think, about wraps it up for today. Does anybody have any questions about anything?
No.
If you missed the announcement at the beginning, we are on hiatus for the Easter Passover break. So I just uploaded presentations and quizzes for this past set of readings, but those won't be due until Sunday. I guess. I'm all mixed up about this actually, but just refer to the revised course schedule and presentation schedule if you are confused about anything. And the quizzes that I posted are not due until April 19th. So you've got plenty of time to work on those.
Right.
Lovely.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Enjoy
Thank you
your
so much.
break. And I will
Thank you.
see you in like another week. Okay.
Hi, Seth.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Seth. Bye.
Thanks.
Wait, how do I get out of this? Oh, okay. All right, bye.
Bye.